extraordinary items known, and so I'll move on to the Acting Chief Executive and Group Financial Officer, Phil Wilson and Peter Gutsall, please. Item 7.
Thank you, Your Worship. Morena, councillors. I'll kick off and then hand over to Peter. I'll start with the FIFA World Cup, and in doing so, just acknowledge the coincidence of events last week with the opening. While there was fairly dramatic events in the downtown area, like the Mayor, I attended the ceremony led by Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei this morning, and just observe it was a nice occasion and an important moment in terms of acknowledging what happened and moving on from it. In relation to FIFA, I would observe that obviously it involved a number of areas in the council group, including those involved with the FIFA organisation, but particularly also Auckland Transport. And I would simply observe that I think our end of it went as smoothly as it could in fairly dramatic circumstances. Given the location, there was significant impact in the transport network, ferries, buses, trains and the like, but also some of the planned events around the opening and the access to Shed 10 and the Cloud was impacted, and I acknowledge the team working on this, led by Megan, who will speak to other aspects of the World Cup in just a second. I'll invite her to do so. Of course, what started in fairly tragic circumstances, we ended the day somewhat differently with a record crowd at Eden Park, and the culmination of a lot of work in terms of support for this event getting underway. Really successful, helped of course by a victory by the Football Ferns over Norway. Sort of good for the mood of the city and good on them. But there's been a huge amount of effort and work done in relation to the FIFA World Cup. So I will just pause and ask Megan, who's been leading the steering team across the group and with FIFA in more than recent months, quite a while. Megan.
Kia ora. Thank you, Phil. And good morning, councillors. Look, I just want to give a few facts and a bit of a shout out to a few people because, look, it is an incredibly exciting tournament. I hope that you have gone to some games or that you are looking to do so. It is really the biggest sporting event for women in the world, and possibly will probably always be. And so it's fantastic that we're jointly hosting it with Australia. So the event has already delivered record ticket sales, over 1.5 million tickets sold, which is a huge amount, and about a third of those are within New Zealand. The FIFA Fan Festival down at the Cloud, again, I hope you've got down there. If you don't, we've got a few weeks to go. It's been really well attended, an average of over 4,000 people per day. We're having lots of school groups in, 3 or 4 a day, which is awesome. There's a unity pitch, a football pitch at the end of the Cloud, out on the water's edge, and it's a really awesome pitch as the kids play there with a beautiful backdrop across onto the North Shore. And Hawani Waititi the school group is doing a documentary of the whole tournament, which is going to be awesome to look at the end. Our thousands of volunteers are making this incredibly special time. They are having a lot of fun, and they are making it fun for the teams, our overseas visitors and delegations. The tournament has been years in the making, as Phil has said, and FIFA has very specific and stringent requirements for the host cities, including turf quality, training facilities, lighting, safety, transport for the teams and delegations, media and advertising. And so I just want to do a shout out to the Auckland Council group and contractors and the management of those contractors. The teams have been amazing, continue to be there on a daily basis to fix those little matters that need to be sorted out. The weather, for example, a few days ago, you know, it impacted some turf, it impacted some of the fencing, and so every day the teams need to go out there and just tidy those things up. You can be incredibly proud of what the teams are doing there. And I particularly want to shout out to the team at Tātaki, who have led the negotiations with FIFA those years ago to get the hosting rights and now lead the host city responsibilities. They're incredibly professional, very highly regarded, and seem to now be able to function on very little sleep because as the tournament is going on, they are literally there from dawn to dusk. And so, again, you can be incredibly proud of what they're doing and the way that they're regarded by FIFA and other international visitors. So it's fantastic. Thanks for the opportunity to do some shout-outs.
Thanks, Megan. Just moving on, or actually before I do, and not to go back to the tragic events in the downtown area, but I did just want to acknowledge the council is providing some appropriate support to families who have been affected by that, the shooting victims' families, that is. And I just particularly acknowledge councillors Newman, Dalton, Bartley and Filipina in terms of helping with that. Now, obviously, you're well aware, you lived and breathed that the annual budget was adopted and took effect from the 1st of July. So what's happening in the organisation now is obviously that we're translating those budget decisions into priorities, work programs and such in the organisation. That's a key focus right now. And insofar as that needs to be translated into the performance objectives agreed with yourselves and the Chief Executive, that's well underway, and you'll see your priorities reflected in that shortly reported back through committee. I do just highlight some priorities that we're focused on within that in the next year, and which I'm sort of communicating out into the organisation, not to exclude things, but clearly the long-term plan is a key priority. The recovery from weather events, obviously very front of mind for us, and the subject of reporting later in the agenda. Suffice at this stage just to say that those negotiations are underway. They're at a sensitive stage. And to the tenor of the submission from the Waitakere Local Board, I can assure councillors that those of us involved in those discussions are very focused on achieving an outcome as soon as we possibly can, but obviously wanting to be really prudent in terms of the costs that flow from that and the precedent nature of what we agree there. So very, very focused on that. We're continuing to work with the CCOs in terms of improving alignment and coordination. There's a focus on shared services within that, and I can tell you we'll report detail later, but we're making good progress in that regard. The water reforms, obviously, they continue to be a focus, and if there are questions in that regard, Megan will assist me in terms of answering those shortly. I would say, though, where have I gone with my notes here? Things are at an interesting stage in terms of the water reform. The establishment board is being put in place by the Crown right now. The organisation design, which goes to the future structure of the entity and the jobs for some of our people in healthy waters and in water care, are being clarified now. So quite a focus in terms of the real change things happening now. Just finally, obviously, focused on, in terms of the annual plan, some of the savings challenges that continue to be a focus for us in the next year. Moving to service performance matters, and just a few highlights there. You'll be interested to know that our statutory performance in terms of delivery of resource consents within the appropriate timeframes has increased. We're at about the 80% level now, so that's an increase from a somewhat lower number in June, sorry. 81% now. Importantly, also, the customer satisfaction's increased from 60 to 71% during the year. It is helped, obviously, by some reducing volumes in that space, but nevertheless, that's good improvement and will lead in turn to good feedback out of the construction industry and such like. Safe Swim was selected as one of 3 winners of the Digital Twin Cities Global Pioneer Project by the World Economic Forum. It's quite a prestigious acknowledgement of that program. Domain Winter Gardens was awarded the Enduring Architecture Award, and the Simon Street Public Convenience and Shelter won in the Heritage category at the Auckland Architecture Awards. So good recognition for some key projects in our capital program. Tonight, there is the culmination of the legal sector's awards. We are finalists in 3 categories, which is recognition of the quality of work being done in our legal team. So kudos to them. I will, while we're talking about legal, and I'm not going to labour this or mount a particular defence, but obviously we're mindful of coverage yesterday around legal costs. So I'll just talk to that briefly now. And those and some consulting costs, I think I would understand councillors having an interest and a concern around some of those costs. I think it's appropriate that we look at those and discuss those in more detail in Councillor Williamson's committee in due course. But I did want to talk to the legal costs now so that the context around those is well understood. Obviously, probably the first point is just to make sure you're aware that when we're talking those legal costs for council, it includes also Tātaki and Eke Panuku. So we provide legal services across the group with the exception of Auckland Transport, although there's some collaboration in that space as well. It is a very busy activity in the organisation. None of us, I dare say, particularly like spending too much money on lawyers, but there are 3,000 active legal files at any one time, and about 80% of them are handled internally. But there's a balance to be found in terms of what we handle internally versus what we outsource, and that goes directly to the question of whether it makes best sense to rely on specialist expertise outside or have it in-house and used less frequently. So there's an optimum setting there. That's been well traversed previously in reviews. There was a Section 17A full review of legal arrangements in 2019 that concluded things were about right. I'm quite happy that we have a look at further insourcing of legal costs, but councillors should understand that that will come with some increased staff numbers in that area. And Even so, I would have to say that I think there is merit in the argument that we look to external firms where we need that really specialist expertise rather than carrying it internally. I think the second point that I would make, just for your understanding, is about half of those external legal costs, so a big chunk of them, are related directly to building defects, leaky building related matters. These are expensive bits of litigation that clearly we don't instigate, but have to respond to. I think the Gore Street litigation is an excellent case in point. 5 months of hearing in the case, quite substantial external legal costs, but at risk is $180 million of claim against the council. So one way to look at this, at least in part, is that these legal costs are an investment in saving us from exposure to much more weighty costs. And I will just say, without going into too much detail, because of the significance of those legal costs in terms of the leaky building costs in terms of our overall exposure, I really do think it's time that we looked further at our advocacy to government around council's liability in this space. So the joint and several liability rule that leaves us as the last person standing in terms of exposure to those costs is frankly not good for us, probably not reasonable and fair, I would suggest, and it's time perhaps to re-energise some of our advocacy around that. Not to deflect from the need to keep a close eye on those legal costs, but I think it's important people understand where they actually come from. You'll be aware that there have been some other major pieces of litigation, and they're part of the context here. Obviously, the defence of the accommodation provider targeted rate going all the way to the Supreme Court. The extensive litigation around local alcohol policy, which Council's also been successful with, and the claim related to Westgate, which we've briefed you on separately. So, you know, I mention those for context, not to be defensive, and very open to further interrogation of that space at Councillor Williamson's expenditure committee in due course. Just a couple of things from me to wrap up. Local board plans, worth acknowledging this is a vitally important step in our process in terms of ensuring clarity around local priorities that will feed into the LTP. They are well progressed, in fact, out at for consultation at the moment. That consultation's closing on the 14th of August, and obviously we will feed in due course the outputs from that extensive work into the long-term plan in due course. And just very finally, just wanted to acknowledge the situation with the St James Theatre, well traversed in the media, but we'll be bringing further material to you around the St James shortly. Suffice to say that government's announcement of a financial contribution matching ours, which sits provided for in the LTP to the tune of $15 million, will hopefully provide a catalyst to progress work in relation to the St James. Probably suffice at this stage just to note that staff are meeting with government officials and the developer, Mr Bilby, next week, and we will be looking to progress that. We're well aware that there's some expectation of timeframes to start that work, so it's important we get on and have those discussions and get real clarity about what we're up for and what we expect in terms of progress with the project and other outcomes shortly. So, Your Worship, I will pause and I will hand, we might have any questions after this, but I'll hand to Peter next. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil and Morena councillors. So this section's around financial performance for Auckland Council Group to 30 June. As we know, the Local Government Act requires the Council to prepare and adopt an annual report and summary report each year, and the Council is also required to publish an annual report under the NZX listing rules. The financial year did end on 30 June 23, and those two reports, the annual report, summary annual report, are currently being prepared. Phil has provided some service performance outcomes earlier, and we have financial performance metrics in the confidential section. The reason for that, Auckland Council has bonds listed on the NZX, and as a result has various obligations arising from the NZX listing rules and the Financial Markets Conduct Act 2013. And so due to those disclosure obligations relating to the Auckland Council Group annual report that sets out the financial year results, the June performance results will be able to be critiqued in that confidential part of the agenda. Worth noting that at this stage the financial results provided are preliminary results and subject to auditor review. They are not yet full and final or signed off, and this information is required to remain confidential until the annual results are released to the NZX, and that's on the 29th of September 2023, so it's still a wee way away. The key part in this is to ensure that all market participants get the benefit of the information at the same time, and no one can buy, hold or sell our bonds with the benefit of insider information, and that is why our financial results and commentary is required to remain confidential until they are released on the NZX. So a very short open session update from me, more about what is to come in confidential, where we can get stuck into those numbers. I'll hang around for questions at the end of this and hand over to the Group Chief Economist, Gary Blick, for his update.
Good morning and ngā marie. A brief update on the economic context over the last month. The theme of recent updates has been the environment of high inflation and the Reserve Bank's focus on reducing inflation via higher interest rates. And many of you will be aware that the Consumer Price Index measure of inflation was released last week for the June quarter, and it showed inflation at 6% in line with the Reserve Bank's forecast. While that's a reduction in the inflation for the first quarter to March, which was 6.7, so it's fallen from 6.7 to 6, most of that falls due to a fall in inflation among imported components, sometimes referred to as tradable inflation, but inflation among the domestic components within the economy remains very high and is yet to materially ease. So that suggests that we've got high domestic inflation, probably from quite a tight labour market still, with wage pressures flowing through to prices, and it suggests that the Reserve Bank will have to keep the official cash rate, currently at 5.5%, as high as it's signalled. So reductions will only come when inflation is approaching the target band of 1 to 3% inflation, and that's not expected until the latter part of next year. So I think the implication for Auckland Council is that there's no sign of inflation or interest rates easing sooner than expected. So we shouldn't anticipate any windfall of near-term relief in the forecast cost pressures. I'd just like to also touch on the fact that these higher interest rates mean that the cost of finance is higher, and that impacts on the Auckland housing market. We've seen the median price down 23% from peak, which was late 2021, although it's still 12% above pre-COVID levels. But in turn, consenting activity, because of the higher cost of finance and the fall in prices, has also been easing, with monthly numbers down 20% this year compared to the same time last year, and that's consents for new dwellings. So we've, the year to May, got 19,500 new consents for new dwellings, and while that's down from 22,000 same time last year, still a very high number from a historic perspective. So prior to the unitary plan, we never really got above 10,000 as an annual total. So my view on that is that it shows the benefits of the unitary plan, which has been operational since 2016, which has enabled many more development opportunities, particularly within the existing urban area, and it's enabled the market to be more responsive to demand for housing right through the highs and lows of the economic cycle. And that's something I'd like to touch on more in a forthcoming newsletter known as the Auckland Economic Quarterly. I'll just leave it there and open for questions.
All right, thanks for that. Thank you, Peter and Phil. My wife and I particularly enjoyed the FIFA opening match after that dreadful day, so thanks for all those who worked so hard to make it a success. With regard to St James, I note that the 15 million agreed in 2016, there's only 4 councillors from that lot still here. There was Walker, Watson, Lee and Darby agreed that one. It's contingent upon work getting underway by June 30th next year. There was an agreement with the government. So there is some pressure on the developer to get things moving before the funding is up for renewal again in the long-term plan, which I don't really mind St James, but I've worked with the Deputy Mayor to get them to stump up their share of the funding, but there is, what the agreement is, it's got to be some start by the end of by June next year. It has sat as a nasty hole in the middle of Queen Street for a very long time, and so it needs to be either started or removed, in my view. With the legal bills and weather tightness, I was shocked to read how much we're spending on the Big Four strategy. I mean, I hope the Expenditure Committee will look into this. I'm sure they will. For lawyers, we're often the last outfit standing when there are claims, thanks to the joint and several liability. It means we have to defend our position even when we may not be at fault. And the central government continue to create legislation and create liabilities for councils, but provide us with no further funding or resource to administer those changes. I think central government need to change the liability setting so that current council doesn't carry all the risk, although Treasury can't see a problem. So this will be a focus of negotiations between myself and the government. If we weren't the last one standing, it would see a massive reduction in legal fees, as the council will have less exposure to risk. More broadly, central government needs to be funding more and not giving us new and unfunded mandates. Anyway, enough for me. There are questions, and so I will ask, before we do that, I'll move and second that we receive this, and then we'll debate on it. That was Fletcher and Deputy Mayor. Okay, questions. Councillor Sayers first, please.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. My question could be directed at you or Phil as Chief Executive. Picking up on the point, thank you for the update about the legal costs, and particularly of interest was 50% going towards this kind of building defect area. So your comment around our advocacy to central government, and you just picked on it up on our Wayne, was is that something in your thinking there? Is that something you might do in conjunction with other councils at front, rather than doing it independently? Just wanted to get an understanding of your thinking in that approach.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. There is a long history to this. I'm not suggesting there hasn't been advocacy previously. It's fallen on deaf ears, but the costs are such that, you know, I believe it should be a priority to link in with the other major councils and re-energise the argument.
I'm certainly supportive of that, Phil, so thank you for your answer.
And it's part of the upcoming election manifesto that I want to have that goes out to both parties to see what they're going to say. Both parties are going to ask them, do you think it's fair that council pick up all this stuff when everyone else runs for cover and is able to use the Companies Act and other things to escape? Personally, I don't think it's fair, and it is manifesting itself in terms of unacceptable legal costs. But if we don't defend, it's even more unacceptable results. So this is a nasty situation. It's very glib for Treasury to not see a problem. Councillor Fletcher, please.
Thank you. And Phil, thank you for the explanations around some of the legal costs. And I'm not going to ever challenge you where there is a very specific issue that we need specialist legal advice on. I think our in-house counsel assist us greatly, but there are other areas that we need that contestable policy advice. The difficulty I have is more where we commission consultants for projects that are never going to see the light of day, likely. And I just wondered what the threshold is, you know, what is the process for going to one of the big PwCs or somebody else for projects that might be marginal in the first instance?
Peter's going to have a crack in the first instance. Thanks, Peter.
Need to work on your poker face, Phil. You look delighted to pass that one across. It's a great question, Councillor. And having seen the article yesterday, I'm slightly prepared for the critique, which is a very fair one. Phil has mentioned the legal aspects and some of the management decisions we take in that space around in-source versus outsource. I first want to recognise that there is no doubt it is a very large amount that we were talking about that we spend over those 5 years in this space. We are a large and complex organisation, and we do need to use that mix of inputs and resources to deliver our services and infrastructure. Likewise, with the legal team, it would not be financially viable to in-source everything and have the organisational scale to be able to internalise all those skills. So the same dynamics that underpin Phil's mentioned regarding legal. Total consultancy and professional costs make up a small proportion of our total spend, but there's always room at the margin to challenge that, and the marginal spend is the one that your question relates to. We have provided quite a lot of detail on the breakdown in this area to ECP, and we're happy to go back again to that committee on a specific targeted basis here. Our control environment for specific engagements, they occur within a controlled set of delegated authorities and approval procedures within a defined budget. So at the end of the day, it's the budget holder that makes the assessment on that. To the degree that it is a element of spend above $50,000, that gets published for transparency purposes on our website as well. We have master services agreements in place that with the Big Four, and each discrete engagements managed through a statement of work to control cost, scope, deliverables, and commercial models are clearly stated and managed. So those are some of the control environments. The demand management.
Do those control environments apply to our CCOs?
Yes, they do. Not necessarily at the same levels, but every CCO is required to have a control environment which works off financial delegated authority and budget constraints. So, broadly yes. And you will have seen some of the commentary from AT around the specifics that they are investing the spend on for their Big Four areas. The demand management is the other element of your question, how we manage the demand for the Big Four and make the choice on whether that is something that should be spent on or not. And that is as important as the rate and price that is agreed in those master services agreement is managing the demand for it. So in general, it's a similar space to legal. We look for using Big Four in areas which are outside the base level competency and capacity of staff to deliver. So that might be because of technical complexity, required independence, specialist advice, such as in the tax area, assistance with submissions to government, again in a specialist area, large transaction support, audits, including in our Green Bond program, where we have to maintain independence, and perhaps some specialist training as well, where it is cost effective to bring people in as opposed to push people out. If I go to the heart of your question, I do believe there are some ongoing opportunities we should look at as to whether we can take an extra step around the control environment here. And there are discussions underway with the CCOs to best determine how we can improve the commercial outcomes we get from our spend across the Big Four as an aggregated group. As part of that, we can look at, and management will look at, considering an additional approval step before committing consultancy spend. So ensuring that we we look at the strategic fit of that spend and take into account your suggestion around why would we spend on something that's not going to progress. That's a key element of demand management that we'll look at as an additional management control. The trade-off of that, of course, is time, complexity and process, but we'll consider that aspect to see what benefits it will take, and I think it fits quite naturally within the ECP remit as part of the procurement policy determinations.
Thank you for that. I also just want to pause for a moment to acknowledge Phil Wilson. He stepped up at a time when things are quite difficult for us. And I'm very quick to criticise, but I also would like to give a bouquet. He has been so fast off the mark on those issues that I've needed a response for. It's only a week ago, Transport and Infrastructure were to be meeting when we had the shootings. Phil was onto it immediately for us, getting certainty around the committee. He has been accessible. He has been thoroughly reliable, and I just think we are very lucky to have you with the depth of knowledge that you bring into this particular role, because it's a unique set of skills that you've got there. So thank you, Phil, for that. I'll finish on giving you the challenge, however, of the issues that have been also traversed today, and that is pushing back on central government, whether for new mandates, whether they be funded or unfunded. I was reminded yesterday when I sat through a workshop on the National Policy Statement on fresh water for farming, just the cumulative effect on the just ongoing torrent of legislation that is coming this way towards Council, to find a more effective way of responding and pushing back so that there is a better, there's some reasonableness in what can be expected from Council. So yeah, thank you very much, Phil.
Look, I'll take that challenge, and thanks for your kind words, Councillor. I was just going to comment on one aspect of your earlier question. I accept management needs to take the lion's share of responsibility around this consulting spend, and as Peter said, we have discussed and we will have a closer look at it and report further on it. So I take that challenge. I would ask as well, as you go about your committee work and in your chairing capacities, when you are asking for work to be commissioned, to also ask the question about the resourcing of that work and its likelihood of, leading to something fruitful or not. Because I take the point that we do a lot of work in the organisation, sometimes that doesn't lead to a tangible outcome that's bankable from a budget point of view. So if we can knock some of that stuff on the head, it's good all round in terms of prioritising our work and spend. So
yeah, I
please
think we all
join
have
us
to take
on that
responsibility
challenge,
for it in terms of that strategic fit, and well done to everybody. I know that John Watson has been particularly keen through the Transport and Infrastructure Committee to ensure that the reputation of Auckland Transport was really positive. On Thursday night, I didn't get to enjoy the game because I had previously accepted to attend the AGM of the Steps, and as a former Minister of Women's Affairs, it was rather sad and a champion for Eden Park not to be there, but the Steps AGM was very, very successful. But I felt so proud at all the feedback that I had on the traffic management plans and people's sense of joy at the games and the result.
Thanks for that. I might permit a comment about the further check on consultant spend. As those of us who ask for it and those who commission it need to think about what is the reasonableness test of this. Yesterday we had an example at the Hamaru housing where a PwC commission report could have been replaced just by chatting to a real estate agent and saving a mere $90,000. So the reasonableness test has to be in everybody's mind, because we are the representatives of the public purse, and some of those things just don't meet the reasonableness test. I know there's pressure from those four to get hired. Resist it. The next question is from Councillor Fula.
Kia ora, Your Worship. I'll try to keep it brief. Just a couple of quick comments and then a couple of small questions. I may be one of the only councillors around the table who does not have a problem with us spending money on legal advice. I'm mindful of
Get a
those
declaration
long-
of interest?
No. I'm mindful of those long processes that we've had to go through and defend, and in particular, the local alcohol policy that many of us have been involved in for many years. When I was chair of the local board, that started, and then 2.5 terms later, that's only just concluded now in court. But other councils who were engaged in that process had to drop out because they couldn't afford to keep in that process. They couldn't afford the legal fees. So I'm happy that we engage professionals when we have to and call on that expertise when we need to. I also accept and totally tautoko the call for us to advocate more to central government around that liability rule as well as other things. And tautoko Councillor Sayer's call to see if we can do that collaboratively as a collective of councils. If only we belong to a collective of councils like LGNZ, that might be easier to do. And my two questions are, people in the community have approached me and asked whether those fees includes our in-house legal team and our in-house financial team. I said no at first, but if that could be clarified, that would be good. And then also, because we do have such a good in-house team, what's the sort of proportion in terms of the amount that we spend on the external advice that we get legally? Kia ora. Thank you.
Through your worship, I think aspects of that will bring back detail post this. I'm pretty sure that what was referenced in the media was purely the external spend, not the internal spend. The author's sitting over the back there, not looking at me, but I'm pretty sure that's right.
Okay, Councillor Turner, please.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I've just got two questions. Just going back to our storm recovery and managed retreat and our water strategy of making room for water. I have no visibility of how those budgets break up. And it's also my observation that talk seems to be focusing on the flood recovery victims, and because we've got the two thing there where we buy out a house at risk but we make room for water. And I just wanted to point out, because of the comments from the local board, that there's no flood recovery issues of any size in the Titirangi Langhome areas. So I wondered, do we have can I see a budget line breakdown of where the money's coming from and how much is for making room for water? Where's the managed retreat for flood victims, and what's being put into the value of managed retreat for slip victims, so that we've got an understanding of where those lines of accounting sit? And my second question, just about the lawyers, etc., and you speak about the big four law firms. Are their contracts subject to the risk and reputations team's matrix of prerequisites that contracting firms have to meet to satisfy our concerns for reputational risk? Thank you.
I'll answer the first one, perhaps while Peter thinks about the second. But can I, and I would just answer the first bit by saying, obviously we have items on the agenda today that are going to look at the budgets separately, but sequentially in terms of the making space for water aspect and the recovery budget aspect. So can I politely ask that we leave that question until we're in that item later in the agenda?
And I'm afraid, Councillor Turner, I wasn't quite sure what the question was for with regard to the consultancy question.
In my induction meetings, we were given some training about how contracts are set for council or contractors are chosen. And there is a matrix of prerequisites that are there to prove to council staff somehow that that these people will not, we can predetermine if they're going to cause us reputational risk. And so I want to know if those criteria are applied to law firms before they're chosen.
Thank you. I have to throw my head back into the very exhaustive legal procurement process that was gone through recently to create the panel of legal advisors and firms that were created, and like any large procurement exercise, it did have the list of prerequisites set out there that they had to meet. I can pull off the weighting of that for you and come back to you specifically on what those criteria were, if you'd like.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, I just feel that these criteria take away the contestable challenge of a tendering sort of process. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think that's a question which we'll refer to Councillor Williamson, who will climb into this with glee and with my full support. Deputy Mayor Simpson.
Oh, thanks. No, my question around the contractors, I think, have been answered very succinctly by the Chief Executive and by a CFO, and I just would like to back Councillor Fletcher's statements on Phil. Well done.
Councillor Leone, please.
Kia ora, Your Worship. First of all, I just wanted to acknowledge the leadership of Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei and the karakia this morning, and the rāhui that they were so prompt on leading the other day. Also the FIFA update, amazing. It's a special time for us to be here in Tamaki Makaurau, aside from the incident that had happened in the morning. I also just wanted to really ask a question on the update on the airport of the shares, sale of the airport shares.
I have no further update that I can provide in a public forum as we are going through the process currently. The information that's available has been is publicly available, so the aspects that are still out there are you can watch the share price as I do, and we continue with the process. In the fullness of time, I will be able to provide a more full briefing, but that's all I can say at this time.
Councillor Williamson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've got a question or series of questions regarding just the one issue called the St James Theatre money. The decision was made in July of 2016. Since that time, construction index has gone up 35%. So if they were to go and do the same work as they were saying 15 million then, they're talking of over at least 20 million for our contribution, and we've only agreed, as this council, was 15, so they'd be 5 short. The government has also announced recently it will give 15, so it'll be 5 short. But my more concern about is the process that this council can get itself into by making an agreement to fund something which may have a never-ending comeback for more money. If we were to pay that 15, and the government to pay its 15, what would happen if halfway through the renovation the people saying, well, we can't finish it unless we get more money? We could actually say, well, there is no more money, that's it. So you'd end up with a half-completed white elephant for which ratepayers would be screaming at us, you wasted 15 million of our money and now you've got nothing from it. Or we could be having to, as we are with the CRL, fund some more. And a few months later, another bid. It was still not there. And I'm terribly concerned that we buy ourselves in, and this council deciding back in 16, and we're still committed to 15 million of that spend, which will not be anywhere near enough based on the construction increase in the index, and how much more. And I'd be really keen for us to explore a way we can get out of that commitment, make a new one if they wish, but not be bound by something from, what, 7 years ago. Can I get an explanation as to what will happen if they asked for more after that.
Through your worship, I'll ask Megan to comment on this.
Kia ora. Look, I think it's a very real and valid question. Firstly, though, there has been an agreement both by Auckland Council and central government that this building and its use as a theatre is something that the public sector should contribute to. So regardless of whether or not everybody around the table agrees with that, that's really the premise on which we started some years ago and where we're at the moment. Clearly, at the moment we've contributed an amount, government has, and the owner or the trust has similarly done that. So what we're doing now is we're meeting next week with government and the trust to then look at what are the conditions, what is that funding agreement going to look like, and we will need to think about some of the issues that you've raised. I think in reality it may well be that there won't be enough money either at a particular point in time or over time generally, and it may well be that either the trust asks us again or government or any other funder to provide more money. I think we need to be realistic that that might well be the case, and at that point you will need to consider whether or not that is something that you want to anticipate. But at the moment we've got the 15 million, we want to work on the agreement about what that looks like, what the parameters are around that, and we want that to obviously start in the coming months, certainly by July 2024.
But Megan, my concern was more to do with if you buy yourself into one of these things, you're then stuck. Because if you say there's no more, then you're left with a hole in the ground down in Queen Street and the ratepayers are saying you spent 15 million of our money and we got nothing. But if you don't do that, you say, well, we'll keep funding you. There's a never-ending demand that could go on, and 30 million later, it's still not finished. And that's why I'm concerned that maybe funding something at the end of its completion and saying you will get this much towards it when you've completed and it's signed off and ready for use. And the second thing I think about this whole thing is, isn't St James going to be a competing interest for something we have in terms of facility that we would like people to use rather than them? And to be funding a competitor, well, okay, I'll leave it at that.
Councillor Winston, look, again, all I can say is you're absolutely right and valid to raise it. The basis on which we're doing this, though, there has been agreement that the council should contribute, and there may well be a need in the future to consider further. And you're right, that might put pressure on us or any other funder. This is not the only time that that we might have pressure to continue to fund something if the money runs out. So that may be the case. That may be the case. Just on your second point, you know, this Queen Street kind of area venue has a number of venues. You know, the Q Theatre, there's Aotea Centre, there's also St James, and the Civic. And so there, in terms of our kind of strategic work with the events and arts sector, we think they are all compatible and work together. They are different venues for different uses, different sizes. So I'm probably less worried about your second point. I take your point on the first.
The agreement with the government was that it's got to start by June next year. As it stands, unless council want to vote more money out of the LTP, for which there's no sign of any enthusiasm so far. So I've got a reasonably sneaking suspicion that we'll have no exposure and there will be no extra competitor. And I disagree with the suggestion that there isn't a competitor. I think at the moment the well-intentioned result of 2016 is that we now have an ugly festering hole right in the middle of our main street. Councillor Lee, who did vote for it, so he might...
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I have a question of the Chief Executive, but just in response to Councillor Williamson's concerns, they're fair concerns. And when it comes to council spending, anyone in the development community will tell you that the council always pays well over the odds because we don't have, evidently, the procurement skills or the attitude in-house to get better value for money. So when the council's in the market, it's a premium for the construction sector. That needs to end. But my question is related, and I want to, in regard to the Chief Executive, I want to endorse the comments of Councillor Fletcher in terms of the Chief Executive's role, and also as a person, as a public servant. I take it from you broaching the awkward subject of the $100,000 per day going on law firms in the so-called Big Four, the global accountancy cartel, that you have concerns about it, because I am not at all reassured by the comment from Mr. Gudzel that all is well, not to worry, it's all in hand. And I contrast that with the attitude the same person took towards Cowrie kids, to community spending when there was the recent crisis, having to sell public assets. There was no question at all about councillors being given the opportunity to trim some of this outlandish spending for the big end of town. So can I take it from you, Mr. Wilson, that you are concerned that you will be investigating, that we will be benchmarking comparatively with other entities and over time to see that this spending is brought back under control, because the people of Auckland will not find this acceptable. Let's not be complacent about it. And senior managers should realise that the people of Auckland find this sort of spending abhorrent. Thank you.
Can I just ask that the personalisation of that be addressed? Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Councillor. Firstly, I'm not defensive at all about the spending. It's deserving of scrutiny, and I'm really happy that we do that internally and that we do it with you, as I suggest through Councillor Williamson's committee. I think that's entirely appropriate. There are aspects of the spend that are, totally deserving of scrutiny. I did not hear Mr. Gudzel at any stage say that he likewise didn't want to apply some scrutiny to this cost and that we would be looking at it. So I do ask, let's not personalise it, and I will make sure that we look at it, and I know, because we've discussed it, that Mr. Gudzel is equally amenable to having a good look at it and being transparent in terms of reporting.
Thank you.
Councillor Darby, please.
Thanks, Mayor. It would be Chief of Strategy's disappeared again. I was going to suggest that we probably are deserving, we need to have a look at a memo on the situation with the St James Mayor. We actually have not made a grant. We haven't made a suspensory loan. We've agreed to a suspensory loan that would then convert to a grant subject to certain conditions which have not been worked up yet. And so you're right on the money, Councillor Williamson. I had similar concerns over the weekend, questions about escalation. But like you, Mayor, the bottom line is that it's an absolute motley mess in the Midtown at the moment, and it's creating a real deadening of that whole block. And it would be great to see it change dramatically. Just a few more comments. So I do recommend that we get a memo reminding us of the resolution and the outstanding conditions. And I expect those conditions to now be worked up collaboratively with government, which is putting in 16.5, I think it is, 15 plus 1.5 that was originally coming from Ministry of Heritage, I think it is. And I, like Councillor Williamson and you, Mayor, would like to see the colour and the quantity of the private capital that's going into that. It's not clear what that is at the moment. So in terms of the conditions, we did by resolution delegate that to the Chief Executive. I'm not suggesting we change that condition, but I think, Mayor, it's deserving of your oversight with Councillor Lee's, and because it's a heritage and urban design issue, it's probably the chair and deputy chair of the parks, of the Planning, Environment and Parks Committee, and there's maybe the deputy mayor interested as well, and Councillor Williamson. But I think it would be good to socialise those conditions politically, and no doubt Minister for Auckland, the Minister for Arts and Culture, I think it is Carmel Sepuloni, and the member for Auckland Central will be interested. But Mayor, I think it needs to be made really clear, because it wasn't that clear in media. We have not granted the money. We have agreed as a council to, subject to conditions, to set up a suspensory loan that would convert to a grant after stage 2 is completed and a philanthropic structure is put in place. Pretty strict. We're a long way short of it.
Thank you for that. I certainly wouldn't be placing a bet at the TAB that will be starting in June next year, but we will find out exactly what the wording was. Councillor Watson, please.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. My question goes to the scrutiny referred to in respect of the consultants' charges or cost as identified in the article in the Herald. And I make it in light, this is 2023, obviously the Super City's been going since 2010, and certainly before it had even started, Professor Ian Shirley, who was a Pro-Vice-Chancellor of AUT University and a Professor of Public Policy, he addressed a National Policymakers Conference in Wellington in 2010, and he said in respect of this matter, local government in Auckland will be replaced with a, quote, corporate structure where the major beneficiaries will be the exclusive brethren of big business, merchant bankers, and a narrow range of consultants dominated by legal and accountancy firms. Now that was Associate Pro-Vice-Chancellor Shirley in 2010. So my simple question is, and it's probably unfair to hit Phil Wilson with this, but I'll do it anyway, is what, in light of that commentary which was made right at the start of the Super City, what benchmarking has taken place since then in respect of Auckland Council and other councils in New Zealand on an appropriate comparison basis, and cities overseas. So really, what benchmarking has taken place over the last 13 years?
I'm not sure I can answer that here and now, but I'm happy to do so downstream. I knew Professor Shirley very well, and he's a loss. So I'm well aware of that commentary. What I would say in answer, though, is that whatever we've done up till now, I have discussed with the team the need for some benchmarking, the utility of some benchmarking going forward. I do think it's a tool that has some use, puts our performance, our metrics into some wider context, and I've discussed that with Councillor Williamson as a sort of adjunct focus for his committee, and I know he has some thoughts on that as well. So it is something for us to focus on going forward.
Okay, thanks for that, Phil. And I think in terms of that focus, I noticed in the article also that reference was made to this new innovative procurement process that was set up in 2018, which the expectation was to save 10 or 20% of external costs for lawyers. By my rough calculations, instead of saving 10 to 20% in the intervening time, it seems to have gone up by 10 or 20%, and at a time of historically low inflation, and if we chuck in COVID, substantial periods of inactivity in council processes. So I hope that that's picked up, and just in relation to that too, as far as our own in-house councils go, there's 63 people identified as being in-house. And again, if I compare that to pre-Super City times, or Rodney District Council, for instance, they had 1.5, not quite 2 in-house legal staff in the times of their operation. So proportionately across the other legacy councils, there seems to have been a pretty substantial growth there. So I guess what I'm looking for, Mr. Mayor, is that some of these specific matters are picked up in terms of the proportion of personnel, in addition to fairly extensive outsourcing, and also the nature of some of the procurement process, and I think particularly in terms of these monthly retainers that have been used in some instances recently, where outside sources are on very generous monthly retainers, and when you request the advice that's given, there doesn't seem to be too much in certain monthly periods. So I hope that we have a look at the actual types of processes that have been involved in engaging these consultants comes up in that review as well.
Thank you for that. You can rest assured that it'll be a focus, and my benchmarking with that one usually involves a machete.
Yeah, I acknowledge the point. We will continue to look at it. I do need to respond to one aspect. Just please be careful not to misunderstand that there were gains, there were benefits out of that procurement process in terms of the rates that we get from the external law firms. The fact is, though, that the work volume, the billable hours, the number of cases is what drives the cost, and it's that's increased. So it's not a bad result out of procurement. It's a function of how much legal work is being done, and I will circulate for people's benefit the Section 17A review that discusses some of this in a bit more detail. Thank you.
That's a good idea. Councillor Newman, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. Firstly, can I just, through you, Phil, I just want to acknowledge and thank Barry Potter and also Councillor Watson and Councillor Fletcher for the work that they have undertaken to get the Te Huia Interregional Service back running in Auckland now, not just stopping at Papakura. That's a good outcome, and I thank the organisation as well as my colleagues for their work on that. And to thank you, Phil, and also to Councillor Filipaina for your work in recent days responding to last week's tragedy. As I speak, there's been another lockdown in another part of my ward this morning, so it's been a very challenging few days, but thank you, Phil, for your support. What I wanted to ask you was, what do you know about the liability if the Three Waters organisational reforms do not proceed as currently envisaged?
I'm not sure if Megan wants to comment, but just to start that, I don't think we've quantified that. Our position at the moment really is that in good faith we've got to work within the paradigm that we've got, the legislation that we've got, and make best endeavours to have it in place per the current plans. If the legislation changes, if there's a change in policy direction, we're going to have to respond to it. And while we've contemplated it, I don't think we've done so in detail. But Megan will comment.
No, you're absolutely right. We are progressing to the 1 July 2024 date. That is now obviously proposed in the bill and will presumably be passed. So we are not actively looking at a plan which doesn't have a move to for some of our functions and our staff to the water entity.
Would it be wise to inquire to ensure that any liabilities in relation to the operational cost of this not proceeding don't sit with us, given that we weren't the architects of this, and that, you know, hearing what has been said this morning about I mean, it's a sensitive area, but, you know, the pressure on local government to respond to the dynamics of what central government sets down to us and the legacy of that in terms of the cost on our balance sheet is not something that we can wear.
Through the chair. So look, we've had transitional, let's call it transitional funding, whatever you want to call it, from the DIA for the last year or so for this work. We have equally asked for another tranche of that for the next 11 months till July 2024 for the very reasons that you raised, like it's your reform and it's costing us. So we've advocated really strongly for that. I don't have a number for that, but at the moment we are using government money to fund the operational costs of this move.
Councillor Henderson, please.
Thanks. Reserve my right to speak briefly on this issue, given the agenda is fairly long. But when we're considering contracting out public services, do we sufficiently address looking into bringing services back in-house instead?
In short, yes, and we have done so on a number of occasions. It'll be subject, those decisions are subject to quite a bit of detailed analysis. I won't go into that in more detail, but yes.
Nice short question. Councillor Walker, please.
I've just got a question, and it goes further to the issue that Councillor Newman raised around costs that are in large part being driven by government. And my question in part goes to yourself, Mr. Mayor. It's okay. So my question goes in part to yourself, Mr. Mayor. We've got consideration of some working groups a little further in this agenda. It strikes me that around matters to do with expenditure, especially around consultants and the massive amount of money that we're spending on legal fees, it would be very helpful to have far more oversight. And I think one of the particular things, and again it goes to the matter that Councillor Newman raised, is I have no doubt the massive amount of expenditure that we're incurring through matters to do with Plain Change 78, to do with Three Waters, to do with other things that are essentially being driven by government that we are having to respond to. It would be very helpful to have some analysis around that, even cursory analysis, because I think it would be very revealing, and it is ongoing. So I have a question as to whether that sort of work could be constituted in one of the working groups. And similarly, there's a working group planned around stadiums, which more rightly should be around venues, of which St James is one. And we still do not have any decision-making framework to determine where investment goes, to determine where content goes, to determine where event funding goes. That is agnostic. In fact, we have a bias towards expenditure in-house when often we'd be better off supporting something external. And the need for transparency around that. So I'm just highlighting to you by way of a question that there's an opportunity to have some oversight in some of these working groups and committees if you're so minded.
Well, I'm hoping to strengthen the committee led by Councillor Williamson and yourself to make it that has a lift every stone and look under it mandate, and if it needs to refer something to another working group beyond that, but that committee now is mandated to particularly look at those issues that you've raised, and I really am looking for a very strong response from that committee. They have, as a result of both of your works, we have now access to much more data than we had. and I join you up because I expect full analysis and feedback to us and advice. And so if more is required, the door's open to come and ask me what it is. Okay, so yeah, I have absolutely no problem with what you've said.
The related question I would put to you is, given that this organisation can be more transparent, and I think that will also occur, there may often be instances where we could get external advice, such as, for example, some councillors got from Mr. John Crawford. There are people out there that the council has an association with that would willingly give us advice if there's transparency and a higher measure of contestability, which I think Councillor Watson alluded to is often not there. So just by way of question, I'd seek your support for more of a mandate around that, so that we go far more outside our own operation to get advice in a collaborative way.
Well, I'm sure if the committee requests the government body fund it to get some external advice, preferably not from the Big Four, but if you insist on doing so, then we'd listen to that. But well, no, but I'm quite happy that you have the mandate to get rolling, okay? Well, you will have later on this morning, I'm rather hopeful. Okay, that does actually finish the questions on that area there. And beg your pardon? You two step back, we'll have comments, although we've had a lot of comments already. Shane Henderson is going to have a comment.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a really brief one, because I know we've got a lot to cover today. Just two things. Firstly, to acknowledge particularly yourself, Phil, for stepping in the hour that we needed it. We've obviously worked together for a very long time and was very impressed with your work, particularly around the floods recently. So I'm really glad that you're here at the helm as the acting CE. It's very nice. Thank you. The second thing I want to point out is that we've had a lot of discussion around the cost of consultants, and to some extent I really agree that we need to scrutinise these things as much as possible. But at the same time, I feel duty bound to point out the challenge is actually ours. We've got to look at ourselves in terms of these costs. It's not just a staff thing. It's not just the central government loading things onto us that we haven't budgeted for. Those things are factors, but it's ours too, because we discuss a lot around this table around contracting out services all the time. All the time. I don't actually remember the last time we've talked about bringing services back in-house that were contracted. It's more often that we talk about contracting out. And at every opportunity, we vote it through. So we've got to look at ourselves too. That's all I have to say, really. But we've got to think about this going forward. How can we bring stuff back in-house? Thanks, Mayor.
Very good. You're expecting we'll buy a whole lot of diggers and road works? I'm pretty sure we could probably fill the hole in College Hill a little bit quicker than AT. But,
Hope so, Mr. Mayor.
But I am hopeful. Councillor Hills, you.
Thank you, Mayor. Two things here, just following on from Councillor Henderson. Once again, we need to be careful of our own decisions, because we keep talking about reducing staff numbers all the time, but significantly increase the number of projects we're doing, significantly increase the ask. There are asks almost every committee for more strategies, more outside information, more independent advice, especially from people who are talking in the corner. And so we just need to be careful that the more we require of our staff to do, and the more advice that Megan and others sit there and say, we do not have scope for X, Y, Z, and then we still ask for those things to happen, they generally have to happen on outside contractors. So we just need to be careful about our asks. The other thing, congratulations, Phil. Thank you for taking up the role for us. I think you'll do a fantastic job. One thing, and I know I have already spoken to you about it, and I wasn't going to ask you a question or put you on the spot, but because of your good relationship with both staff and elected members, I appreciate conversations already about some of my concerns of elected members and their behaviour around staff and the way staff have been feeling. But I do hope, as you are the only person, well, the CEO is the only person employed by us, you're probably the only person who can tell us what to do in some ways. There has been concerns, comments, racist, sexist, homophobic, things like that. There have been posters ripped down from our floor talking about revitalising Te Reo and preventing racism and things like that, making staff feel very unsafe, and that spread through and that hasn't been discussed with other elected members. So I guess my concern is that I know you will do your job to help prevent that type of thing and make staff improve their well-being, and also please call it out in a private way to people who are challenging staff in an inappropriate way, because I think we've been a huge amount through the budget of cutting jobs and cutting funding and things, and there's a lot of pressure, and if we don't get the staff in a positive light on the decisions we make, then we don't get a lot done around here. So just want to say that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. All those in favour of receiving this report, please say aye. To the contrary, no, carried. We're going to, talking of